My name is Tracy Barton-Barrett, and I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor in the state of North Carolina in the US. I see clients primarily for grief, anxiety, life transitions, and I have a specialty in pet loss and companion animal loss. To show that I'm not only here professionally but personally tonight, this picture of me holding a cat is our cat Rutherford B. Barrett, also known as Bubby Bear. And we lost our Bubby Bear earlier this year, in May of this year, as a matter of fact. So the thing is, they just don't stay with us long enough. And if we invite animals into our lives, it's almost an inevitability that we will see the end of them. So I just wanted to honor our Bubby Bear and also have a little candle here to honor all the animals that we've lost. So doing a little overview, we're going to look at roles animals play in our lives. What is grief? What does it look like? The stages of grief, the tasks of mourning, incorporating your spirituality and religion into healing, ways to honor your animal, and self-care, self-compassion, and self-forgiveness. And one of the things that you're doing for self-care and self-compassion tonight is being here. I know it can be very difficult to talk about these things, but I'm glad that everybody can be here to support us and support you through this difficult time. So when we look at the roles that our animals play, if I were to ask you, how would you describe them? You might say they're my best friend, they're a member of the family, they're a confidant, support, especially during the pandemic. There could be a sense of identity. There's an older couple around here that has a big standard poodle, or a standard poodle, and they're known as the couple with the big, beautiful standard poodle. And poodles prance, and it's a part of their identity, who they are. You might also um, do frisbee with your dogs, or show cats, or show horses. And so your animals actually become a part of who you are. They could also be emotional support animals or service animals. Those are two different things. I'm not going to get into that tonight, but they could also be a part of that for your life too. And animals could also represent different times or chapters in our lives. When we were a child, when we were in college, before we got married, before we had children, when we lost a partner or a spouse. They can also be sort of markers for times in our lives too. Some might be more difficult or traumatic than others when they were there for us. So just validating that they did that for us and that they were there for us during that time. And even looking at the financial impact, at least in the US in the year 2020, Americans spent, and this is only Americans, spent 103.6 billion dollars, up from $97.1 billion in 2019. And this number has gone up every year, even during the Great Recession in 2008, 2007 to 2009, those numbers were increasing. So it's not only the financial impact and the emotional impact, but both of those together show that they really play a very important role in our life. So, in a few words, share with us about your beloved, the one that's really staying with you tonight, that's really on your heart tonight. In the chat, say their name, what breed of animal they are, if they're a horse, a dog, a guinea pig, a bird, a cat, and just a few words about them that make them special to you. So thank you so much for sharing that. So now looking at the grief part of this. So grief is a natural reaction to something or someone to which there is an attachment or a value placed upon. It's important not to pathologize grief. I know the DSM had some controversy around that. I'm not going to get into that tonight, um, but it's important to know that it's a natural reaction. Grief is love with no place to go. Sometimes people will say that. And the thing that came to me after we lost Bubby is grief forces you into a world that you weren't ready for and maybe never even wanted. So you might be thinking, I didn't want to not have my animal with me. So it's hard for me now to create this life without them. And that's part of the healing process. Healing and grieving is rarely linear and it's a very individual process. And closure is not the goal. And that might be somewhat confusing. So, closure usually indicates a stamp that we're all done, it's all done. No more having to think about it. The thing about grief is that it never completely goes away, it just becomes less intense and less prevalent. Um, so you might get to a point where you have a half a day or an hour that you're not crying or thinking about them, your beloved animal. Um, or it could be 10 years later and you still go back to the tears when somebody talks to you about it. So it's never completely out of the picture. It just becomes less intense. So, what can grief look like? Sadness, hopelessness, crying, pulling away, anger, sometimes misdirected, sometimes appropriate. The shame, especially with pet loss, like I'm ashamed to say I'm having a really hard time with this. A lot of clients will talk about that. Feeling numb, feeling lost, like I don't know what to do now. Like I don't know what to do. Time gets warped. Some clients have talked about the day that they had to make that terrible decision. Um, Time seemed really slow, and then it gets really fast, and then it gets really slow again. And then there's the semantic symptoms. So we feel grief in our body, but particularly this can show up in children. Headaches, stomach aches. Um, some adults in particular will experience something called a broken heart syndrome. It can feel like a heart attack, but it's not actually a heart attack. Then there's something psychomotor retardation, and this just means moving slower. So people might feel like they're moving through mud and everybody's talking and moving so fast. When did that happen? That can also be part of grief. And sometimes, and this is a huge generalization, men can sometimes present more with irritability and anger than actual sadness. So if your partner or spouse is grew up with these, or it could be you too, grew up with these messages that the only feeling you can feel is anger. Everything else, you can't feel too happy. You certainly can't feel hurt or sad. It can kind of get channeled into anger. So it's just something to be aware of. The next slide is the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross framework. So some of you might be familiar with this: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. It's important to use this as a framework and not as prescriptive. In other words, it's important not to get hung up on being in a certain stage, being in denial for 2 weeks and then anger for this amount of time. And I'm doing it wrong. How do I do grief? That's the thing, it's very individual. So this can provide guideposts and a framework, but it's not the end all be all. So just something to keep in mind with that. And one of the biggest feelings that clients will talk about is the feeling of guilt. Making that decision about euthanasia can be one of the most difficult decisions you'll ever make. I've heard that so many times. I should have done this. I should have done this. The shoulda, woulda, couldas can keep a person stuck. I should have taken him to the vet. I shouldn't have gone on vacation when I knew he was sick. I shouldn't have done the chemo. I should have done the chemo. I mean, it can just be overwhelming. And this is how animals are like children, in that we make all their decisions for them. They literally have no power or control over what happens to them. So, as a result, guilt can be part of that. The other thing, too, is that as you move through healing, there's possibly some relief that a person feels, and then they feel guilty about that. So, in the case of the guilt and the regret, this is where self compassion and maybe some self forgiveness comes into play. And depending upon how the animal died, it can look many different ways. And this could really be deep work. So, and again, or I meant to mention earlier that as we're talking tonight, some things might come up for you, and I highly encourage you to share that with your therapist when you meet with them again. So, how are you feeling tonight? In a few words, just share in the chat how you're feeling tonight. Um, where would you put yourself? What are you struggling with? Just a few words, and then I'll highlight a few, and then we can talk about